William from Exploding Word Ministries. We're continuing with our gospel lessons on Mark's Gospel. We're on chapter 11, and we start with the triumphant entry of Jesus to Jerusalem. So let's start immediately, as we intend to go on here. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' tell them the Lord needs it, and will send it back here shortly." So the disciples went. They found a colt outside in the street, tied to a doorway. So they began to untie it. And sure enough, some people came up to them and said, "What are you doing? Why are you untying that colt?" So they answered and said, as Jesus had told them to say. And the people said, "Oh, that's okay then. Take it with you. Bring it back later." So when they brought the colt to Jesus, they put their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Now an amazing thing started to happen, because the people around and about began, the multitude that always followed with Jesus, they began to take branches and cloaks and spread them on the road. So this was indicative of a king coming into his glory. And it was something that the people would do as homage to someone of worth. And so as they were doing this, the people ahead of them, who were seeing this too, started taking down branches and putting them down on the road. And they all began to shout, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." And Jesus entered Jerusalem. He went to the temple. He looked around everything. And since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. We need to examine what's going on here. Mark has immediately taken us to Jesus preparing to go to Jerusalem. And we know this is towards the end of his ministry. So Mark has carried us all the way through very quickly towards the pivotal concept of Christ's ministry. And so he's now entering Jerusalem. And when Jesus sends the disciples ahead to get the colt, this is in fulfillment of a prophecy which says, "Your king shall come riding on a donkey," the colt, riding on an ass, and the colt of an ass. And that's what he's doing. He's actually riding on the colt. And he comes to them, a king, recognizable, able to be identified. And the people are seeing this. But there's also another concept here that we need to consider. You see, Jesus is coming in by the east gate. He's coming in from how can one put this? He's coming in where the expected Messiah is to come from. Now, some people would say that at this time of year, when Jesus is coming in here at this Passover time, that they were preparing for different things happening, and this gate was open for that reason, that they opened it up to allow the Messiah to come in. And this was Christ coming. And the people recognized that. They called him King of David, King, the father of his kingdom, the father of David, and all of that was coming true. So we see here the expectation of the multitude, the expectation that the Messiah has arrived, that this is the Messiah, that he is the king, and that he is going to establish his kingdom. So this has concerned the priests. This has concerned the religious leaders. This has concerned the Herodians. Because if this is the king, what will become of them? When Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he goes to the temple, and he looks around. He gets his bearings, but it's late. He doesn't do anything. So he heads off and takes the night in Bethany. But the next day, as he's leaving Bethany, Jesus is hungry. And so, seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if there was any fruit on it. And when he reached it, he found no fruit, because it wasn't the season for figs. But Jesus responds to the tree in an unusual way. He says to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit of you again And his disciples heard him saying it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple court. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves"? Now the high priests and the teachers of the law heard this, and they began looking for ways to kill him. For they feared, because the whole crowd were amazed at his teaching. And even came, and Jesus again went out of the city. We begin to see more teaching here, more concepts of the Messianic belief structure coming through here. Jesus is presenting himself with the authority of a king, as one who can make changes, make judgment changes. And as he comes to the temple, this is what he's considering doing. He's went yet the day before and looked at what was going on, and he goes the next morning with the intention of making a few changes. But on his way, he saw a bush. He was hungry, and he thought, well, it's in a leaf. I might as well go and see if it has any food. But it had nothing, so he cursed it. We often think this is a very strange thing. Why did Jesus curse the fig tree? Well, first of all, we need to understand God's provision. God's provision for all Christians is equal. It's what God lays out in advance for you. So when Jesus was hungry and he saw the fig tree, he believed that God had provided for him a meal on his way to the temple, to give him a bit of strength, to allow him to satisfy that hunger. Yet when he went, there was no fruit. So Jesus cursed the tree. No one will ever give you again, because when your time had come, basically this is what he said to the tree, when your time had come, you weren't ready. You didn't have any fruit ready for your God who created you. You haven't prepared yourself in preparation for my need. And therefore, a curse is upon you. Now, we need to take this very, very seriously, because Jesus says the exact same thing to us. He warns us that when he returns, he wonders, will he find faith on the earth? And in another place, he reminds us that the prophet Elijah is to come and restore all things, unless, and if he doesn't, if Elijah doesn't come and restore all things, if people don't take on the message which has been given to them, then Jesus says, I will come and I will smite the earth with a curse. And we've seen the power of Jesus' curses here. What happened to this willow, this fig tree? It withered. From the root, it died. And this is something we need to understand. Jesus, as King, has power to exercise authority over life and death. And his judgment is always right. We need to take note that we do not represent in any way whatsoever this fig tree. We need to be under no delusion that God is going to accept us in or out of season. He's not going to consider the fact that, well, it's not time for figs yet. No, he expects there to be growth, because it's a supernatural power that is empowering us. A supernatural power. So he expects to see fruit when he desires it. And that's an important thing for us to remember. And we need to get that into our heads as we go through these things and learn from these things. On reaching Jerusalem, we showed that Jesus overturned the tables. Now, the people watching this were quite amazed. And they would have been, because they understood that what Jesus was doing here was stamping his authority over the authority of the high priest. He was stamping his authority over the authority of the Sanhedrin. He was stamping his authority over the civil authority of the day. Because He was saying, this house is a house of prayer. He overturned the commercial trading within the temple. He forbid them carrying out their function to be able to meet the needs of the sacrifices. Because by stopping them selling doves, by stopping them selling their wares, he was preventing them from doing the sacrificial offerings. He was interrupting the process. And he was doing it as a demonstration that what they were doing was no longer acceptable to God. Again, in the Old Testament, we read that God has asked us to not give him sacrifices, but a contrite heart. To be willing to show love and concern for each other and not just for ourselves. And that he prefers that over any form of sacrifice or worship. He wants us to worship by presenting his character in this world. And his character is outgoing love towards mankind. And that's what we're to be as well. So as Jesus begins to take his authority, he makes immediate enemies. The high priests, the teachers of the law, they began to look for ways not to stop him, not to challenge him, but to kill him. Because they recognize that he is a major threat, because the people accept him as the authority figure. And so they do not want to become second but to Jesus. In the next morning, as we read, they went along out of Bethany, and they saw that the fig tree had withered. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed, it's now withered. Have faith in God, Jesus answered, and I tell you the truth. If anyone says to this mountain, go and throw yourself in the sea, and does not doubt, what he says will happen. Therefore I tell you, whatsoever you ask for in prayer, believe it and you will receive it. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your sins will also be forgiven by your Father who is in heaven. But if you do not forgive, don't think your Father in heaven will forgive you either. Because this is an important concept. We need to understand this. Now, we saw that Jesus cursed the tree because it didn't provide him with figs when he was hungry. But as the disciples are now witnessing the death of the tree, they are startled by it, because trees don't die overnight. They just don't up and die and wither completely like that at the command of someone. And so they're quite taken by it. They're quite surprised. Yet Jesus says to them, why are you so surprised at this? Whatsoever you say, if you really believe it, it will happen. This was scary because it meant that from a Christian's perspective, we have to be very careful about what we say, because if we really say something and mean it, if it's something deep in our heart and we say it, then it will manifest because of our belief in it. And that's why we have to be very careful not to hold grudges against people. That's why Jesus is bringing this out. Because if we hold a grudge against somebody, if we have a problem with somebody, if there's somebody's done something else and we're not just happy to let it go, we could forget ourselves. We could speak evil into that person's life. And because of our position in Christ, that evil will carry into that person's life. Now, you need to take this on board, because Jesus didn't say you might be able to do this. He said you would be able to do this. He said if you believe, you can do this. You could even tell that mountain to go and throw itself into the sea, and it will do it if you believe and don't doubt. So he's not telling us we're limited, or that it only belongs to the apostles, or it only belongs to the God. He's saying this is open to mankind, because once you understand the relationship with Jesus Christ, there is no longer any barriers put on your authority, because you exercise the authority of the Son of Man, who has come in the authority of the original Adam. So we have to understand that concept. Jesus is exercising the authority given to him as the Son of Man, not as God, but as man. And that authority is over all things, because in Genesis we read that all authority was given to Adam. But Adam spiritually died when he rebelled against God through his disobedience. He chose death so he wouldn't lose Eve. But through Christ, that authority has been restored back into the church. And so Jesus is warning us, telling us of the importance that we understand it and to be careful with it because of what we can actually do. So in many ways, we need to understand the withered tree in two ways, both a danger to ourselves when Jesus returns, but also our own authority, and to be careful not to abuse it. When Jesus arrives again back in Jerusalem, and while he's walking in the temple courts, the chief priests and teachers of the law and the elders came to him and asked him a question. They said, "By what authority did you do all those things yesterday? Who gave you this authority to do this? Who told you you had the right to do that?" You can understand their position. Jesus said to them, "I will ask you a question. And if you answer my question, I will tell you by what authority I do this. John's baptism. Is it from heaven or is it from men? Tell me." Now they started to discuss this among themselves, and they said, "If we say it's from heaven," he will say, "then why didn't you believe him? But if we say it's from men," they feared the people, because the people believed that John was a prophet. So they told Jesus, "We don't know, we can't answer that." So Jesus replied to them very simply, "Well, in that case, neither am I going to tell you by what authority I do the things I do." And that's where the end of chapter 11 comes in Mark. But what did Jesus mean by this? Why did he fire that challenge to them? Well, let's understand first of all the situation. These people, the scribes, the Pharisees, the leaders of the law, the priests, were meant to be in charge. They were meant to be making decisions on behalf of the people. But they feared the people. They feared the civil government. They feared the possibility of everything being ripped away from them, rather than fearing God and standing up and doing the work that they were meant to be doing. Jesus gave them an opportunity. He asked them a straight question. John's baptism, heaven or men? What do you think? Now the question wasn't what they could have answered. It wasn't a case of, if you answer me this, that's okay, and if you answer me that, that's all right. That wasn't what Jesus was worried about. He wanted an answer, because if they answered him, then they would step up to the plate, so to speak. They would show their understanding of their own position. But they didn't. They allowed the situation around them to manifest. They allowed everything about it to be dominating their approach. So rather than answer the question, they simply subdued and said, "We can't do that. We can't answer that question." And as a result of that, Jesus refused to answer them. But he not only didn't refuse to answer them, he also refused to recognize their authority. And as we see, that continues throughout the rest of the gospel. So this is William from Exploding Word Ministries. We're going to be doing Mark 12 next time. So until then, God bless.